Welcome to part 2, where we're going to discuss what thoughtful lesson design actually looks like. Now, before we dive in, I will also be showing you the scoring rubric that will be used to evaluate you in both practicum and student teaching. So let me pull that up right here. This is going to be available for you in the Brightspace. I'm not going to go over it in detail now, but as you're reviewing your lesson plan, I want you to look at what it requires for proficient and compare and contrast that with what you submitted with this week's assignment. So, to continue, as you're using this rubric, this isn't just about getting points for an assignment. It's really about learning how to design instruction that holds up under scrutiny. Now, these criteria are what mentor teachers, supervisors, and future evaluators will use to evaluate your lesson plans. All right, now that we've talked about misalignment and teacher responsibility in the past video, let's shift gears. I want to show you what thoughtful, complete lesson design actually looks like and how it compares to what many of you submitted last week, which is why it's important that as we go back and we look at the lesson plan submitted, that we do it with an open mindset. Because this isn't about calling anyone out, it's about seeing the gap between where you are and where you need to be. Now, let's talk about the model lesson I created. For this particular lesson plan, which I've created, is for this assignment, which is an expression of experience 3. Okay, and so this will also be attached, and this is a full lesson plan that I have that I want you to read through, and you're going to compare and contrast my lesson plan to yours. Okay, again, this is going to be a full lesson plan, and it's aligned directly to the rubric. You'll notice that every section, objectives, technology, vocabulary, differentiation, etc., is written so another teacher could implement it without needing me in the room. And that's the bar. The lesson plan, if it is left for a substitute teacher, I should be able to read that and take your place as a teacher and carry it out without a problem. Now, let's begin to contrast what I have in mine with what I saw in your submissions again last week. And again, this isn't to judge, but to teach. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that this goes in the Graceland format. Now, it's not in the Graceland exact template where you're filling stuff into that Word document, but you'll notice I have a space for candidate name, grade level, time allotted. If you follow that Graceland template, it follows that straight down. So for the time allotted and the section, many plans listed like 20 or 30 minutes without accounting for flexibility, interruptions, or deeper engagement. The model lesson gives a baseline and explain how lessons may unfold over multiple sessions based on pacing and student needs. That's what makes it teachable and adaptable. So I'd like you to compare my time allotted section to what yours looks like. The next thing I want to draw our attention to is technologies, where I have both a teacher and a student responsibility. Next, I want to draw our attention to the subject areas, where I have my primary, education, but I also have the connected subject areas, in this case social sciences and psychology, as well as a description. If you notice the scoring rubric, you have to connect it to different subjects to receive a 4. To continue down to the next spot, I want to talk about the key vocabulary words. Now, for your assignments, most of them included vocabulary, but very few had a plan for how students would understand, use, or revisit the vocabulary. The model lesson right here that I have, it both introduces, reinforces, and embeds vocabulary with discussion prompts and reflection expectations. And that is what's required for a 4. So make sure you read through this vocabulary and compare and contrast it to what you submitted. Now, the next section is the management plan. I call this the engagement plan, and so I have it in parentheses. And here's where most of you were far too brief. Several plans listed materials or groupings, but didn't explain how students would be supported behaviorally, socially, emotionally, cognitively during the lesson. The model plan used the Relationship Clarity Challenge framework, which is also social emotional learning to get students to engage, behavioral learning to get students to engage, and cognitive learning to get students to engage, which is from psychology, right? And so that's what's going to turn your lesson format or your engagement plan into something that's effective. I'm not going to belabor this, but I want you to look through this and look through the difference about what I do within mine and how I articulate stuff and what you have submitted. The next thing that I want to draw our attention to is the Iowa Core National Standards. Some of your plans listed very vague standards or only one strand. Others didn't match the listed standard to the actual learning, meaning the standard that you listed had nothing to do or wasn't connected or aligned with what the assignment was actually about. Right? The model plan both names the Iowa Teaching Standard and the INTAS standard. Obviously, I don't have Iowa Teaching Standards as far as the core that you would have or 21st century skills, but this does align to my Iowa Teaching Standards and the Interstate Teaching Assessment and Support Consortium Standards, which is your INTASC. So I want you to compare and contrast what I have for mine and what you have for yours. On to the next section, measurable objectives. This was another common gap. Objectives like students will learn about sounds, our students will practice reading, are not measurable. You need to write these in a way that is measurable. In contrast, the model plan provides an essential learning target as well as 3 cognitive level objectives tied to Bloom's taxonomy and how students will show their understanding. This relates to chapter 2 of the text that you should have read. Right? Students will define and explain. Can I measure students defining and explaining? Right? Students will reflect on how personal educational experience are impacted, and they'll talk about these. Can I evaluate, look, and judge that? Right? And I want you thinking about that as we go through. Now comes the meat and potatoes for this week's lesson. Right? And this is going to be important. First of all, I want you to look at my lesson format. Notice that I tie it to prior learning to start. I talk about the introduction, I give exact examples of what I'm going to be doing, how I'm going to monitor progress, etc., and I link it to the next lesson. When you're looking at your lesson format, you want to see if it's similar or different than mine and why. Now we're coming to where we really need to work, and that's what the Todd Rose video that you're watching this week is about. When I look at differentiation sections in all of your lesson plans, this was one of the biggest gaps in almost all submissions, and one of the clearest links to the Todd Rose message about the myth to average. Now, Rose argues that when we design learning experiences for a mythical quote-unquote middle student, we unintentionally exclude everyone else, especially students with jagged learning profiles. In several of your plans, differentiation was treated as a side note. For example, one lesson said TAG students could read a harder passage, while others use sticky notes or anchor charts. That's not differentiation. That's just giving more work to some kids and not designing a learning path that fits their needs. Another plan included a kinesthetic option using tiles and manipulatives, but didn't actually change the instructional structure for students who were struggling or accelerating. Without alternating pacing, tax complexity, grouping, and entry points into the context, we are still teaching to the average. I want you to know that to meet the Graceland template expectations, differentiation needs to be visible during instruction, not just at the end. Who gets pulled in the groups? Who gets pre-teaching? Who leads discussions? What scaffolded roles or tools are offered to assess the same goal through different means? In my model lesson, differentiation shows up as a sentence in sentence stems, rotating discussion roles, and targeted extensions for high readiness learners. These adjustments are embodied directly in the learning process, not bolting on in the end. You will see them in my lesson formatting. If you're not designing to the edges, you're designing for no one, as Rose would say. And differentiation is how we start shifting away. So again, looking at my differentiation section, I want you to read through this on your own. I want you to think about how that works, and I want you to compare it with what you guys had. The next section is accommodation modifications, which in some areas is probably the most concerning. Now, the accommodation and modifications sections are also essential, but they're not the same as differentiation. In the Graceland template, this section is where you show how you adjust access to instruction and assessment for SPED, ELL, and TAG. And I'd even make the argument that we should go beyond that. However, in most of your submissions, this section was either A, missing, or B, too vague. One plan listed use visuals or scaffold is needed. Another said NA for all 3 student groups. What that tells me as a parent who has both a TAG kid and a special education kid is that my daughter who's TAG doesn't matter to you. She's not applicable. She doesn't matter in your classroom. Or my son who's SPED doesn't matter for you. It's not applicable for the classroom. So I really want you thinking about when you look at SPED, ELL, and TAG and put not applicable, what that basically entails. It says that students who have those abilities or disabilities are not welcome in your classroom. And this ties back directly to Sinek's argument about creating an inclusive environment, one where anybody can engage. And NA says that unless you fit these standards, you're not allowed access in here. You're not allowed to participate. Right? So again, I want you to read through my accommodation modification section, what it is, and compare and contrast that to your own. Lastly, we have assessment, right? And so when you click on my assessment, you'll see that it pulls up the exact assessment that I have, and you're going to have how it links to the measurable objectives, so on and so forth. So I want you to read through that so that you can understand it, okay? So, missing or incomplete sections overall. Some of the lesson plans I saw skipped essential components like data analysis, student reflection, or connection to the next lesson. And all of these are required for practicum level lesson planning. Now, I know that you can't do your after reflection and some of the post analysis you can't do because you haven't actually taught this yet, which is why it's fine in that case to be blank. But what I do want to do, and I give you examples in my lesson plan when you look at it, is what that looks like. So when you get into student teaching or you get into practicum, you can do that. So here's what you need to do now. 1, you need to read the model. Don't just skim it. Read through it with the rubric next to it. 2, when you're looking at my model lesson plan and all the components of it, I want you to compare it to yours and ask, where did you stop early? Where were you too vague? What would a mentor teacher say if they had to teach from your lesson plan? Next, don't try to match my voice or match my clarity. It doesn't have to be exactly like mine. I want your lessons to work for your learners, not just to meet the format. However, you have to have these ideas embedded in there. Now, in week 6, we're going to revise your Applied Learning 2 assignment, right? The script, the model plan, and the rubric will be your roadmap. Not because I want your plan to look like mine, but because I want you to work better for your students. And that's how we move from theory to real teaching.